Hey everyone, and welcome back to another industry report. Well, after a bit of a break, it actually looks like the loot box regulation debate is back on. The UK government has responded to all that stuff we covered last year, and they're actually taking things forward. The endgame here is major. Potentially, it could see loot boxes actually be reclassified as gambling and therefore governed by the Gambling Act, and that is something that would deeply change the industry in one of its major markets. So today, it's a pretty big video. As always, be sure to like and subscribe, and if you are in the market for more news, content, and also a bunch of loot, including the Druid pin, then be sure to check out our Patreon via the link in the description below. It seriously does keep this channel going. So, thank you for your support, and let's get into the news. Things sure have been quiet on the loot box front since that explosion activity towards the tail end of last year, so let's have a quick recap before we head into this new part of the story. So, consumer concern about loot boxes hit the government radar in 2017, and they've been digging into it ever since with the help of the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sports, DCMS. Now, last June, the DCMS held a round of interviews with several high-profile representatives from the games industry. That, of course, is where you will remember EA dropping their surprise mechanics gem, and Epic showing quite a staggering lack of concern for things. Now, the DCMS, not exactly heartened by how those meetings went, much like many of us, well, they pushed on ahead and they released the Immersive and Addictive Technologies Report in September of 2019. Now, this report advised the government to reclassify loot boxes as gambling, right? And that would bring them under the legislative umbrella of the 2005 Gambling Act. Now, that would be fundamentally a massive shift for the industry. These recommendations were then later backed up in an October 2019 report by the UK Children's Commissioner and then a statement from the NHS's mental health director in January of this year. So while not on, I would say that at that stage, the noose very much was tightening. It just wasn't on yet. Well, the newest report, and the reason that today's video exists, is the UK government's official response to the DCMS's recommendations. Now, this actually means that it carries a bit more weight and that the ball is actually beginning to roll on the government side of things. Now, this response includes a formal call for evidence that is intended to help guide future policy development. Now, it's a bit unclear exactly what kind of evidence the government are looking for or when the deadline for submission actually is going to be. The government typically elaborate after the fact, but their official website can only confirm the details will be in due course. So basically, we don't know exactly when it's kicking off. They've just said they are going to kick it off. Now, luckily, a bit of digging does give a better idea of what they're actually looking for. So the government is going to require evidence of the size of the loot box market, how they're designed, and how they align with other types of in-game spending. Now, the impact on consumers will also be considered, as will any links between loot boxes and problem gambling/excessive spending. Now, this written call for evidence will also inspire a series of roundtables designed to discuss issues and solutions in detail, including the most effective ways to protect users. And yes, it very much does sound like with almost every government thing, there'll be many committees, many roundtables, and, not a lot of speed. Now, the results of this call for evidence will be considered alongside the review of the 2005 Gambling Act and will provide what they say is a solid foundation for future steps. And it also emphasizes that the government will, quote, stand ready to take action, right? They've said they're standing ready to take action should the outcome of their call for evidence confirm the need for action. And I suppose that will be quite an interesting thing in the comment section, whether you guys actually believe there is that need. Now, the DCMS will also use the results to establish a framework for investigating the impact of gaming on behavior. Now, while this is the first official comment that we've had in loot boxes in months from the UK government, it is not exactly something that's massively dramatic. The government essentially have said they still need more information to do something, but I think what matters here is that this is the ball rolling from the government side of things and not just the DCMS. Now, one thing we should remember here is that the government actually noted a few of the genuine steps that have been made in regards to loot boxes in the last few months. So back in April, PEGI announced that they would be flagging paid random items in games. Now, that caused a bunch of controversy because to a lot of gamers, it's loot boxes, but the thing is, if you say loot box to, and this is where I actually think PEGI were right, if you say loot box to a parent, they just won't know what that means. point, but if you say paid random item to a parent, well, that is just a more descriptive term. So that was added onto the in-game purchases label that was introduced in 2018. Now, this measure was explicitly highlighted in the government's response as a sign of positive progress within the industry, as was another recent decision by PEGI to give games with simulated gambling an 18+ recommendation automatically. And now the initiative should be fully in place in summer 2020, and the government notes that they will be taking a close interest in the impact of this new approach. So, if the government do eventually classify loot boxes as gaming, how would that impact the industry? What would it actually mean, say, for you? Well, it would actually possibly be quite profound, depending on how things go. If the UK went in the same way as other anti-loot box countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, then companies could be forced to pull their games from sale or redesign their games in such a way that they fit all of the new requirements to protect players. So yeah, EA, 2K, Blizzard, and Psyonix, they've all fallen foul of this stuff elsewhere in the world, and they probably would not be too keen on this type of regulation happening in the UK. Now, there is another question here on how the regulations would impact the revenue streams for publishers, and if every publisher would be hit equally, and I think there the answer is a clear no. FIFA Ultimate Team is typically used as a boogeyman example here. Now, it was discussed at length in EA's grilling by MPs, that's members of parliament, last year, and it featured prominently in both the DCMS and Children's Commissioners reports later in the year. Now, Ultimate makes an absurd amount of money. This year, EA's net revenue from Ultimate was almost $1.5 billion. Not only did revenue top $1 billion for the third straight year, but the fact that the revenues are nearly triple what they were in 2015 shows just how far Ultimate Team has came in terms of its reach and its profitability. So EA would be none too happy to see that revenue be disrupted if required by the UK government, and it would be a very, very difficult revenue stream to replace, because you've got to remember here, the UK is a massive, massive football country, okay? Massive market then for FIFA, meaning FIFA Ultimate Team. So that regulation would sting EA pretty darn hard, especially if you also saw increased regulation in European countries, EU countries anyway, as well, right? Like we've already seen stuff with Belgium and the Netherlands. It would be very hard to redesign FIFA Ultimate Team to be compliant with those types of requirements. So just the thing of turning some of that stuff off in Belgium, that wouldn't work, right? Because it's the UK. It's such a large market for that game. The random nature of packs then, like that is a strong psychological hook for players, and it's a big driver of profit for EA. They won't want to give it up. And unlike, say, Rocket League's new blueprint system, I think it's unlikely that Ultimate Team would hold the same appeal for players if they could just buy whatever they needed. And that is a really sad part of game design here. It's what people say they do versus what they actually do. And the depressing thing is that a well-masked, well-designed Skinner box actually does work, and they actually can make people have increased self-reported joy in games. Now, believe me, I wish this was not the case, right? I really do. But not everybody is a core gamer who is watching a video about UK loot box legislation on YouTube. There's a lot of people who just literally do not think about this stuff. They just take it as is given. It's a what you see is what you get situation. They think about football trading cards from when they were a kid. They think this is all fine, and that's that, right? That is probably most of the market you're dealing with here. It's not people like us. Now, we've said before in this channel that the government will always be reluctant to legislate against gaming here, to regulate a bit harder. The industry is extremely lucrative. They won't want to interfere with it in that much of an official capacity. Also, once the government steps in, well, then that's another thing that now is in the purview of government. So will they want to do that? Will they want to wade into another industry? Nonetheless, though, the call for evidence, while nothing monumental, is still an admission from the government that something is not quite right, and that they will legislate if they feel they need to do so. Now, when coupled with praise for the initiatives that the industry has undertaken on its own, the call for evidence, it almost feels like the government stalling for time, maybe in the hopes that the industry will sort itself out a bit more. PEGI's recent moves, right, they're certainly a step in the right direction, but ultimately, it just doesn't feel like it's going to be enough in the long run for me. Why is that? Well, it's because people are sometimes not behind the driving wheel of what they're doing, and also parents. Now, there are also examples of psychological outliers, okay? People who, just are more vulnerable to things like gambling. That is obviously a big problem and something we need to deal with. But then there's also those two categories. There are responsible adults with a regular life, regular income. They don't think about these things deeply. They don't question why it is designed this way. They just think, oh yeah, that's how much a pack that could have the Ronaldo I want costs, and they buy it. Right, that is something that you're just not really going to escape. There's a whole bunch of people, you don't see them on YouTube, but they're totally fine with that. And then also, there's parents, and this is where I'm going to say that the government should not need to do parenting. Parents should be able to do parenting, and that they're not very good at it sometimes is really bloody sad. Parents have had the tools to curb this stuff for years and years and years. And they basically don't that often. Tech companies are halfway bending over backwards to give people parental controls, and parents just don't use them. If you are on iOS or Android or Xbox or whatever, you have parental spending controls, and the parents just don't use the bloody things. And then they complain, oh, my kid took my credit card and did all this stuff, when it's actually like, no, you were irresponsible with your kid, you were irresponsible with your credit card, and now what? You're crying to the government to get this to be fixed because turned out you could not manage your child. And I know that sounds pretty animated for me, but truly, I do believe that responsibility is a very, very important thing, right? I think that responsibilities are just some of the things that maybe define people in a very good way and make them better. And whenever I see, I guess, people not taking responsibility of what they should be responsible for, in this case, what their child is doing online, and then they scream to the government about it, you know what? That's... there's a bit of me that actually does think that it's just an outlier of bad parents making a lot of noise. So yeah, it really is tricky. Okay, we should be in a world where I'd say a few things should happen. Number one, where rational consumers should see what's going on, see these systems as a pile of BS that's just designed to be a cash extraction Skinner box, and say no. But sadly, that's just not something that customers really do that much. Which, yes, is really sad. And then also, yeah, that, parents would actually use parental controls and things like that. And I suppose it is just a reflection of the sad state of things when, yeah, those two factors don't really happen, right? This stuff continues, and no matter how much people who are maybe thinking about these issues or maybe try to have a principled stance on them, however much they try to do that or maybe, be involved in advocacy, it just sort of feels like the psychological hooks are so strong that it's a bit hopeless. And I suppose that is then when the government is going to come in and say, maybe we should do something. So I suppose that's really where I want to leave this video. What do you think the government should do? Do you think this is something where the solution is government, or do you think the solution is industry, or do you think maybe the solution is on the individual? I would love to know what you actually think there and how you think things would shake out. So do let me know in those comments down below. Of course, be sure to check out the other content on this channel. We've got the State of the Publishers series. We've got a bunch of other things. Check out our video on Paralives and Temtem, the indie games that are actually stepping up to the plate and taking on a bunch of AAAs. It's a really, really cool story. Anyway, that's it for me. Thanks for watching. I will see you next time.